But I really want to get to, I want to shed some light on some interesting things that most people don't know and most doctors don't know, okay? Which is, what is the role that other foods actually play here? So if anybody's been listening to me for any length of time, by now you probably have heard me say that in my career as I've been moving along and I continue to learn in this world of functional medicine, but if there's one common denominator that I see over and over and over again, regarding whatever the diagnosis is or the symptomatic complaints are, whether they be neurological, hormonally, pain-driven, whatever it is, the common denominator is the immune system. And what does the immune system do when it's activated? It increases an inflammatory response. So again, the inflammation is at the root of all chronic degenerative types of conditions, right? And that's why when you go to the food store, right, we see magazines all over the place. I have one in front of me right now. It's called Clean Eating, and it's called anti-inflammation. Reset your health with the anti-inflammatory approach. Right. And we also get people started on what we call an anti-inflammatory diet. So the key here is obviously is we want to reduce inflammation. So remember, reducing inflammation really is reducing a Th2 response. It's trying to reduce the mast cell activations. So when we're having that seasonal allergy, we're getting phlegmy and coughy and stuff, right? We're tethering too much on the Th2 division, more pro-inflammatory. So is the Benadryl enough? Is the supplements enough? And the answer is no. And here's where I want to go with this. For some time, we've known about things known as cross-reactivity. So when you talk about the immune system, you cannot talk about the immune system and not talk about a subject which is called cross-reactivity or cross-reaction. So what does that actually mean in layman's terminologies? Right? Simply put, if the immune system is reacting to one thing, it can possibly cross-react with something else. So the immune system, when the immune system is reacting to anything in our bodies, right, what it reacts to are proteins, right? So what is your body made up of? It's made up of proteins, right? So the immune system can react to your own body's proteins, and that's what an autoimmune condition is, right? So if the immune system is reacting to the proteins that make up your thyroid gland, you get diagnosed with autoimmune thyroid known as Hashimoto's. If your immune system is reacting to the proteins of your digestive tract, you would get diagnosed with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So the diagnosis of an autoimmunity is just descriptive of where the immune system is creating the attack. Now, what about cross-reactivity? So again, if you talk about foods, are foods proteins? Yes, foods are proteins. Even carbohydrates have a protein structure to it. So the immune system can react to food proteins. So the question is, does the molecular structure of the food protein look similar to the protein structure of your own self-tissue? Or does it even look similar to the protein structures of plants and other things like pollen? So if we take an example of gluten, so many people know they're gluten reactive or suspect of gluten reactive or have tried gluten-free diets. Fair enough, right? So what is the connection between gluten, for example, and the thyroid? Well, if your immune system sees the protein structure of gluten as something foreign, right? Meaning it sees it as what is called an antigen. An antigen refers to anything that's foreign to the body, foods, pollens, anything, chemicals. So if the immune system sees the gluten structure protein as something foreign and it creates an immune reaction against that, it triggers an inflammatory response. Step one. If the protein structure of gluten looks similar enough to the protein sequencing of your thyroid proteins, then that's called an epitope. Then your immune system really can't tell the difference between the gluten and your thyroid gland. So if you are eating gluten and your immune system is reacting and creating inflammation and attack against the gluten protein, it turns around and it cross-reacts with the thyroid. That's known as cross-reactivity. Okay, what's that got to do with allergies? Everything. Okay, so when I was a little kid, I learned really early on that I have a reaction. This is without testing. I knew I had a reaction to apples, peaches, pears, plums, and cherries. Cherries, especially. If I ate those foods, my mouth would just get incredibly itchy. My throat would start to close. I would get hivey and feel almost feverish. Felt terrible. No matter how many times I tried to get over it, I had the same reaction. I just learned to avoid it, right? But what do these foods do? They fall into a category known as rosacea, right? And what they do when the immune system reacts to that, the immune system releases a high amount of histamine. So when I ate those foods, my immune system dumped a whole bunch of histamine to my body, and it was the histamine that was making me feel really bad, right? So I learned, okay, I want to avoid those foods. But if I ate other foods that released histamine, what would I get? My ears would get really red. My skin would get flushed, like rosacea. I was getting a histamine reaction. Now, in many people, myself included, is there's an enzyme in our digestive tract known as DAO, or diamine oxidase. And that enzyme helps our digestive system to break down foods that release histamine. So there's a lot of foods that release histamine, like tomatoes, for example. In my particular case, genetically, is I don't that enzyme doesn't work so well. So if I'm eating a lot of foods that have high amounts of histamine in them, and they're releasing histamine in my digestive tract, the lack of that enzyme can't degrade and break down that histamine. So now the food that I'm eating is creating a histamine reaction, and I'm feeling lousy again, and mucousy, and all that kind of stuff. Let's turn, I hope you're following this. Let's turn now to the pollens and the allergens, which is really a fascinating thing because I ran some tests on myself, allergy tests some time back. And one of the things that stood out that I have a high reaction to, an allergy response to, is birch trees. Birch trees, which are predominant in the Northeast. And ironically, I happen to have 5 birch trees on my property. Not a good thing, right? So here it is, I have an allergy reaction. So during the season, the birches are blooming, they're releasing birch pollen. I have a allergy to that. So what do I want to do? Okay, I'm going to avoid, I'm going to stay indoors, I'm going to wash, I'm going to shower and clean, all that kind of stuff. But here's what's interesting is that we know now that there is cross reactivity. There's the cross reactivity with food proteins. Birch pollen cross reacts with certain food proteins. And here's a list of some food proteins. Hazelnuts, apples, there's apples. So a long time ago, I learned that I had a reaction to apples, right? Apples, listen to this, celery, carrots, and soy. Okay, what does that mean in English? That means that even if I'm avoiding the birches or I'm away from the birch trees off my property, there is cross reaction between celery, carrots, hazelnuts, apples, and soy. So if I am eating, unbeknownst, a lot of people are doing celery juice drinks, carrot juice drinks. So if I'm eating a lot of celery and carrots and hazelnuts and apples, right, my immune system is reacting to that equally as it is the birches. So if I'm eating those foods, I am heightening more aggressively my immune system's reaction when it's exposed to the birch pollen. In fact, what research is telling us, okay, is that when people have food allergies, most food allergies that people develop is really as a cross reaction to pollen allergies. What is this again? So I'm trying to make sense of this, right? Knowing that I have a reaction to birch pollen, it would behoove me to make sure that these foods, celeries and carrots, also in this category, really, they're showing signs of tomatoes and spinach also, some of the, and eggplants, some of the foods that fall into the nightshade categories. So I need to get those foods out of my diet, knowing that I have a birch tree reaction. What's confusing, right? So you go to the store, I'm looking at a magazine, the Anti-Inflammation Reset Your Health Diet. And what are they showing in here? They're showing all the vegetables and fruits, right? Tomatoes and spinach and avocados and all these things. Unbeknownst that when people eat those foods, they could be feeling worse. Right? And so you're like, your head is spinning saying, well, what am I supposed to do? Oh, one thing you could do is you could run the tests. You could really labs that we work with, they will run tests. They will run inhalants. They will run these food things so we can determine where there are potential cross reactions, so that you know that, oh, even though I like doing my celery juice drink, maybe I shouldn't be doing celery juice drinks, especially during the spring pollen season. I should avoid carrots. I should avoid tomatoes and spinach during those things. I would say collectively, I mean, the first thing I would take out, honestly, during this season would be fruit. That's right, you heard me, fruit. Fruits, especially, okay? Everything from grapes to citrusy fruits to melons are very cross reactive with the majority of people, with the environmental pollens that have been released. That's inclusive of birch trees, oak trees, grasses, ragweeds. Okay, these common foods that we eat, these fruits and these vegetables are very cross reactive, which means even though you're doing the best you can to avoid the grass and all that stuff and wash and stay indoors, if you're eating these foods, you're not going to feel any better. In fact, you might even feel worse. So I hope that sheds some light on what is called cross reactivity. I can spend 2 hours talking about cross reactivity.